The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Millfield as the crowd gathered around the hastily constructed gallows in the town square. Jake Coleman reined in his horse at the edge of town, his weathered hands gripping the leather as he surveyed the scene before him. The wooden platform stood like a monument to injustice, its shadow falling across faces that should have shown doubt, but instead reflected a bloodthirsty certainty that made his stomach turn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 28 years of hard living had taught Jake to recognize trouble from miles away, but this was different. This was the kind of trouble that demanded a man look deep into his soul and decide what kind of person he truly was. The crowd pressed closer to the gallows, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation that reminded him of vultures circling a dying animal. Women clutched their children's hands while pointing at the platform. Men adjusted their hats and spat tobacco juice into the dirt, and somewhere in that mass of humanity, a young man named Thomas Mitchell sat in a jail cell, counting down his final hours. Jake's horse snorted and stamped, sensing the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The animal's unease matched his own as he watched Sheriff Robert Kane emerge from the wooden building that served as both courthouse and jail. The lawman's badge caught the morning light, but there was something wrong with the way he carried himself, something that spoke of a man who had sold his honor for the right price. 3 days earlier, Jake had been nothing more than a drifter, passing through the territory, his saddlebags light and his conscience heavy with memories of past failures. He had learned to keep moving, to avoid getting tangled up in other people's problems, because every time he had tried to do the right thing, it had cost him dearly. The loss of his family's ranch still haunted him, a reminder of what happened when good men stayed silent while evil flourished. But fate had other plans for Jake Coleman. The first sign that Millfield was different came when Jake stopped at Mary Sullivan's Silver Dollar Saloon for a meal and a room. The establishment stood at the corner of Main Street and Railroad Avenue. Its painted sign faded by years of desert sun, but still legible enough to promise whiskey and hot food to weary travelers. Jake had pushed through the batwing doors, expecting the usual mixture of cowboys, gamblers, and working girls that populated such places throughout the territory. Instead, he found a room full of worried faces and hushed conversations that died the moment he entered. The bartender, a thick-set woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, looked him over with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Her hands never stopped moving as she polished glasses with mechanical precision, but Jake noticed how she favored her left side, as if old wounds still pained her. "You're new," Mary Sullivan said without preamble, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had grown up far from the Arizona desert, passing through or staying. Jake settled onto a stool at the bar, his spurs ringing against the brass footrail. "Depends on what I find here," he replied, studying the woman's face. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter, but newer ones that suggested recent sorrows. "Right now I'm looking for a meal and maybe some information." Mary's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their endless polishing. "Information's dangerous in Millfield these days," she said quietly. "Safer to eat your food, drink your whiskey, and ride on without asking questions." The warning should have been enough to send Jake back to his horse and out of town, but something in the woman's tone caught his attention. It wasn't fear exactly, but the kind of careful resignation that came from watching injustice triumph too many times. He had heard that same tone in his own voice after losing the ranch, when he had stopped believing that fighting back would make any difference. "Sometimes a man can't help but ask questions," Jake replied, accepting the plate of beans and cornbread that Mary set before him, especially when he sees good people looking like they've lost something important. Mary glanced around the saloon, noting which customers might be listening. Most of the patrons seemed absorbed in their own conversations, but Jake noticed how several men near the back table kept glancing in their direction. Their clothes marked them as ranch hands, but their manner suggested they were more interested in watching than drinking. "We've lost faith," Mary said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Faith in justice, faith in the law, faith in the idea that good people can make a difference." She leaned closer, pretending to wipe down the bar near his plate. "Tomorrow morning, they're going to hang Thomas Mitchell for stealing cattle from Charles Brennan's ranch. Problem is, half the town knows Thomas is innocent." Jake's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The name Brennan meant something even to a drifter like him. Charles Brennan owned the largest spread in 3 counties, and his influence reached into every aspect of territorial politics. Men like Brennan didn't accumulate that kind of power by being fair or honest, but they rarely left evidence of their corruption lying around. "If half the town knows he's innocent," Jake asked carefully, "why isn't anyone speaking up?" Mary's laugh held no humor. "Because the other half of the town works for Brennan, and the half that knows better is too scared to risk their livelihoods." She moved away to serve another customer, but returned a few minutes later with a cup of coffee that Jake hadn't ordered. "Thomas Mitchell is 24 years old. He works as an apprentice at the blacksmith shop, goes to church every Sunday, and sends half his wages to support his sister Emma's medical expenses." The coffee was strong and bitter, but Jake barely tasted it as Mary continued her story. Emma Mitchell had been born with a weak heart, a condition that required constant medical attention and expensive medicines that the siblings could barely afford on Thomas's modest wages. The young woman taught school to contribute what she could, but her health limited how much work she could handle. Emma's the reason Thomas was near Brennan's ranch the night they claimed he stole the cattle, Mary explained, glancing again at the men by the back table. Doc Hayes had gotten word of a new treatment being tried back east, something that might help her condition. Thomas was riding out to Brennan's place to ask about extra work, hoping to earn enough money to send Emma to see a specialist in Denver. Jake set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. The story was taking shape in his mind, and he didn't like the picture it painted. A young man desperate to help his sick sister would be vulnerable to manipulation, but he would also be unlikely to risk imprisonment by stealing cattle. Unless, of course, someone had made it look like he had no choice. What did Thomas see that night? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mary's eyes darted around the saloon once more before she leaned in close. Thomas never made it to the main ranch house. He was riding along the canyon road when he heard cattle moving in the dark. Curious, he dismounted and crept closer to see what was happening. She paused, as if weighing how much to reveal. What he saw was Brennan's own men driving a herd of cattle toward the border, talking about selling them to Mexican traders and splitting the money. The picture became clearer with each detail. Brennan's men had been stealing their boss's cattle, probably skimming from his herds for months or even years. They had needed a scapegoat when the thefts became too obvious to ignore, and Thomas Mitchell had walked right into their trap by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They caught him watching? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake guessed. Worse, Mary replied. Thomas tried to ride away without being seen, but his horse stumbled and went down hard. The noise brought Brennan's men running, and they found him trapped under his horse with a broken leg. Her voice grew even quieter. By the time help arrived, Thomas was unconscious, and the stolen cattle were back in Brennan's pasture. The men claimed they had caught him in the act of rustling. Jake pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. The setup was neat and simple, the kind of frame job that would be impossible to disprove without witnesses willing to testify against powerful men. Thomas had been injured and unconscious during the crucial moments, unable to defend himself or explain what he had really seen. What about tracks, evidence, anything that might prove the men were moving cattle before Thomas arrived? Jake asked. Mary shook her head. Sheriff Kane didn't look very hard for alternative explanations. He arrested Thomas the next morning and had him charged with grand theft by afternoon. The trial lasted less than 2 hours, with 3 of Brennan's men testifying that they caught Thomas red-handed. The efficiency of the legal process told Jake everything he needed to know about Sheriff Kane's integrity. Real lawmen investigated crimes before making arrests, especially when the evidence was circumstantial. Kane had been more interested in closing the case quickly than finding the truth. "Where's Thomas now?" Jake asked. "In the jail behind Kane's office, probably praying for a miracle that isn't coming." Mary began wiping down the bar again, her movements sharp with suppressed anger. "Emma's been trying to see him, but Kane won't allow visitors. Says it's for security reasons, but everyone knows he's just being cruel." Jake studied the woman's face, recognizing the frustration of someone who wanted to help but felt powerless to act. He had seen that same expression in his own mirror too many times to count, usually after walking away from situations where he might have made a difference. What about evidence that might clear Thomas? Surely someone else must have seen something, or there must be some proof that Brennan's men were involved in cattle theft. Mary glanced toward the back table again, and this time Jake followed her gaze. The ranch hands were no longer pretending to mind their own business. They were listening intently to every word, their postures tense with the readiness of men prepared to act on what they heard. "Doc Hayes might know something," Mary said carefully. "He's been treating Emma's heart condition, and he was the one who examined Thomas after the accident. But Doc keeps his thoughts to himself these days, especially when it comes to anything involving Charles Brennan." The mention of the doctor sparked Jake's interest. Medical men were often privy to information that others missed, and their professional obligations sometimes put them in positions to observe things that ordinary citizens would never see. If Doc Hayes had examined Thomas after the supposed cattle theft, he might have noticed details that contradicted the official story. "Where can I find this Doc Hayes?" Jake asked. Before Mary could answer, one of the ranch hands from the back table stood up and walked toward the bar. He was a tall man with the bow-legged gait of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle, but there was something predatory in the way he moved that set Jake's nerves on edge. "You're asking a lot of questions for someone who's just passing through," the man said, positioning himself close enough to Jake that his intentions were clear. "Maybe you should finish your meal and move along before you hear things that might upset you." Jake turned on his stool to face the man directly, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "I appreciate the advice," he said evenly, "but I've always been curious about local customs. Helps me understand the places I visit." The ranch hand's eyes narrowed. "Some places don't welcome curiosity, stranger. Some places prefer that visitors mind their own business and keep their opinions to themselves." The confrontation was escalating exactly as Jake had expected it would. Men like these relied on intimidation to control information, and they wouldn't hesitate to use violence if they thought it necessary. But Jake had faced down his share of bullies over the years, and he had learned that backing down only encouraged them to push harder. "I understand completely," Jake replied, his voice remaining calm despite the tension. "But I've also learned that when good people are afraid to talk, it usually means bad people are doing things they shouldn't be doing." The ranch hand's face flushed red with anger, and his hand moved toward his gun. Mary stepped between them quickly, her own hand disappearing beneath the bar where Jake suspected she kept a shotgun for just such occasions. "That's enough," she said firmly. "This is a respectable establishment, and I won't have gunplay in here. If you gentlemen want to settle your differences, you can take it outside." The ranch hand glared at Jake for a long moment, then stepped back. "Maybe we will," he said. "Maybe we'll settle this real permanent-like." Jake stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening but ready for anything. "I'll be around," he said simply. "If you change your mind about having that conversation." The ranch hand and his companions left the saloon without another word, but Jake knew they would be waiting outside. Men like that didn't make threats. They weren't prepared to carry out, and they had the advantage of knowing the town and its hiding places. "You need to leave Millfield," Mary said as soon as the batwing doors stopped swinging. "Tonight, before word gets back to Brennan that you've been asking questions." Jake finished his coffee and placed a silver dollar on the bar, more than enough to cover his meal. "I appreciate the warning," he said, "but I think I'll stick around for a while. Maybe pay a visit to Doc Hayes." Mary shook her head. "Doc Hayes won't talk to you. He's got too much to lose, and Emma Mitchell depends on him for her medical care. If Brennan decides the doctor is a problem, Emma could die waiting for treatment." The information added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Doc Hayes was caught between his professional obligations and the reality of small-town politics. He couldn't afford to antagonize Brennan without risking his ability to help his patients, but his silence was contributing to an innocent man's impending execution. "What about Emma herself?" Jake asked. "Has anyone talked to her about what?" Thomas might have told her before his arrest. Mary's expression darkened. "Emma's been trying to see Thomas since the arrest, but Kane won't let her visit. She's been getting sicker with worry, and Doc Hayes is afraid the stress might trigger a crisis with her heart condition." She paused, then added quietly, "Yesterday, Emma told Doc that she would trade her own life for her brother's if she could. She said she would give her heart to save Thomas, even if it meant she wouldn't survive." The young woman's desperate offer resonated with something deep in Jake's chest. He had seen that kind of selfless love before, the willingness of family members to sacrifice everything for each other. It was the kind of pure devotion that made a man believe there was still good in the world, even when surrounded by corruption and cruelty. "Where does Emma live?" Jake asked. "In a little house behind the schoolhouse," Mary replied. "But you can't go there. If Brennan's men see you talking to her, they might decide she's a threat too." Her voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "These people have already killed once to cover up their crimes. They won't hesitate to kill again." Jake felt the familiar weight of a decision that would change everything. He could mount his horse and ride out of Millfield, leaving Thomas Mitchell to face his fate and Emma to grieve for her brother. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing, the same choice he had made too many times before when faced with other people's troubles. But something had changed in Jake Coleman. During his years of drifting, maybe it was the accumulation of all the times he had walked away, or maybe it was seeing the desperate love in his sister's willingness to trade her life for her brother's freedom. Whatever it was, he found himself unable to consider leaving. "Mary," he said quietly, "I want you to get word to Emma Mitchell that someone is going to help her brother. Tell her not to give up hope, and tell her not to do anything foolish until I've had a chance to investigate." Mary stared at him as if he had announced his intention to fly to the moon. "You can't be serious. You're one man against Charles, Brennan, and everyone who works for him. They'll kill you before you get within a mile of the truth." Jake stood up and adjusted his gun belt, checking that his Colt revolver rode easy in its holster. "Maybe they will," he agreed. "But Thomas Mitchell deserves better than dying for something he didn't do, and Emma deserves better than losing her brother to a lie." The commitment felt strange after so many years of avoiding involvement, but it also felt right in a way that Jake hadn't experienced since losing his ranch. For the first time in longer than he cared to remember, he was choosing to stand up instead of walking away. As Jake headed for the saloon doors, Mary called after him. "If you're determined to do this fool thing, you should know that Doc Hayes usually makes his evening rounds about an hour before sunset. He checks on his sickest patients, including Emma Mitchell." Jake tipped his hat in acknowledgement. "Thank you for the information," he said. "And thank you for caring enough about that boy to take a risk by talking to me." Mary nodded grimly. Just don't get yourself killed before you have a chance to do some good. This town has seen enough senseless death already. Jake pushed through the batwing doors and stepped into the afternoon heat, immediately scanning the street for signs of the ranch hands who had confronted him. They were nowhere to be seen, but that didn't mean they weren't watching from windows or doorways. In a town like Millfield, information traveled fast, and Jake's interest in Thomas Mitchell's case would be common knowledge within hours. The street stretched before him like a gauntlet, lined with businesses that depended on Charles Brennan's goodwill for their survival. The general store, the livery stable, the hotel, even the church at the far end of town, all existed at the pleasure of the cattle baron who controlled the local economy. Standing up to Brennan meant risking not just personal safety, but the livelihoods of anyone brave enough to help. Jake's horse waited patiently at the hitching post, swishing flies with its tail and occasionally stamping a hoof against the dusty ground. The animal represented freedom, the ability to leave Millfield behind and continue the rootless existence that had defined Jake's life since losing his ranch. All he had to do was mount up and ride away. Instead, Jake walked toward the sheriff's office, determined to get his first look at the man who was willing to hang an innocent person for the convenience of Charles Brennan. The sheriff's office occupied a squat adobe building at the intersection of Main Street and Courthouse Road, its thick walls designed more for keeping prisoners in than keeping the desert heat out. Jake approached slowly, taking note of the barred windows and the heavy wooden door that had been reinforced with iron bands. This was a structure built by men who expected trouble and wanted to be ready for it. Sheriff Robert Kane sat behind a scarred wooden desk, his boots propped up on a stack of wanted posters while he cleaned his fingernails with a knife blade. He was a big man gone soft around the middle, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent more time indoors than chasing criminals across the open country. His badge was polished to a mirror shine, but his clothes were wrinkled and stained with what looked like whiskey and tobacco juice. "Help you with something, stranger?" Kane asked without looking up from his fingernails. His voice carried the lazy drawl of someone who wasn't particularly interested in being helpful. Jake stepped into the office, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor. The interior was stifling despite the thick walls, and the air hung heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco smoke. A single barred door at the back of the room led to what Jake assumed were the jail cells. "Just curious about the hanging tomorrow," Jake said, settling into the chair across from Kane's desk without being invited. "Don't get to see much law enforcement in action out on the range." Kane looked up then, his small eyes studying Jake, with the calculation of a man trying to decide whether he was looking at a threat or an opportunity. "Thomas Mitchell," he said finally, "caught red-handed stealing cattle from Charles Brennan's spread, open and shut case." There was something in Kane's tone that didn't ring true, a forced casualness that suggested he had rehearsed this explanation many times. Jake had heard enough lies in his life to recognize when someone was trying too hard to sound convincing. "Must have been quite a chase," Jake observed. "Young man like that probably knew the country pretty well." Kane's expression hardened slightly, no chase involved. Mitchell was trapped under his horse when Brennan's men found him. Horse went down in a prairie dog hole, broke the animal's leg and Mitchell's too. He set down his knife and leaned back in his chair. Brennan's boys said they heard the cattle moving and rode out to investigate. Found Mitchell trying to crawl away from the scene. The story had the mechanical precision of something that had been carefully constructed, but Jake noticed several details that didn't add up. If Thomas had been stealing cattle, why would he have been alone? Rustlers usually worked in groups, especially when dealing with valuable livestock. And if his horse had gone down in a prairie dog hole, what had happened to the cattle he was supposedly stealing? "Sounds like Brennan's got some loyal hands," Jake said. "Not many cowboys would." Right out in the dark to check on cattle movement. Kane's eyes narrowed. Charles Brennan runs a tight operation. His men know their jobs and they do them without complaint. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. You ask a lot of questions for someone who's just curious about local law enforcement. Jake shrugged. Like I said, don't see much of this kind of excitement out on the range. Makes a man wonder about the details. He paused, then added casually, Mitchell have anything to say for himself at the trial? Mitchell claimed he was innocent, if that's what you're asking. Kane's voice took on a mocking tone. Said he was riding out to Brennan's place to ask for work when he heard cattle moving and went to investigate. Claimed he saw Brennan's men stealing their own cattle to sell across the border. The sheriff's summary confirmed what Mary Sullivan had told Jake, but it also revealed something important. Kane wasn't trying to hide Thomas's version of events, which suggested he was confident that no one would believe the young man's story. Over the testimony of Brennan's employees. Interest in defense, Jake said. Man's own employees stealing from him. That would take some coordination. Kane stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Mitchell was desperate to help his sick sister, and desperate men do desperate things. The jury heard all the evidence and made their decision in less than an hour. He walked around the desk to stand close to Jake, using his size to intimidate. Case is closed, stranger. Mitchell hangs tomorrow morning, and that's the end of it. Jake rose slowly from his own chair, matching Kane's aggressive posture without escalating the confrontation. Just making conversation, Sheriff. No harm in that. Depends on who you're making conversation with, Kane replied. This is a peaceful town, and we like to keep it that way. Strangers who ask too many questions sometimes find that peace doesn't extend to them. The threat was clear enough, but Jake had expected it. Men like Kane relied on intimidation because they knew their authority was built on corruption rather than justice. They were dangerous precisely because they had so much to lose if the truth came out. I appreciate the warning, Jake said, moving toward the door. Wouldn't want to disturb the peace. As Jake reached for the door handle, a voice called out from the back of the building. It was weak and hoarse, but clear enough to understand. Is someone out there? Please, I need to see my sister. I need to tell her something important before tomorrow. Kane's face flushed red with anger. Shut up back there, Mitchell. Visiting hours are over, and you've got no visitors anyway. Please, Thomas Mitchell called again, his voice breaking with emotion. Just let me see Emma. Let me tell her I'm sorry for all this trouble. Jake felt something twist in his chest at the sound of raw desperation in the young man's voice. This wasn't the plea of a guilty man trying to escape punishment, but the anguish of someone who knew he was about to die for something he hadn't done. Sounds like he's got something weighing on his conscience, Jake observed. Kane moved quickly to block Jake's path to the door. Mitchell's got nothing to say that anybody needs to hear. He's a condemned man, and condemned men will say anything to try to save their necks. But Jake had heard enough to confirm his suspicions about Thomas Mitchell's innocence. Guilty men facing execution typically focused on their own fate, not on apologizing to family members for the trouble their crimes had caused. Thomas was thinking about his sister's welfare, even in his final hours. I'll be moving along then, Jake said, stepping around Kane and opening the door. Thanks for the conversation, Sheriff. Kane followed him onto the wooden sidewalk, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Remember what I said about strangers who ask too many questions. This town can be dangerous for people who don't mind their own business. Jake touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement and walked away, acutely aware of Kane's eyes boring into his back. The sheriff's threats had confirmed that there was more to Thomas Mitchell's case than a simple cattle theft, and Kane's nervousness suggested that he knew it. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the adobe buildings of Millfield in shades of gold and amber. Jake had perhaps 2 hours before Doc Hayes made his evening rounds, time he could use to gather more information about the night Thomas Mitchell had been arrested. He made his way to the livery stable at the edge of town, where a grizzled old man in patched overalls was shoeing a horse. The blacksmith looked up as Jake approached, his weathered face creased with the kind of suspicion that seemed to be endemic in Millfield. "Help you with something, mister?" the man asked, not pausing in his work. "Looking for information about the night Thomas Mitchell was arrested," Jake said directly. "Heard there might be folks who saw things that didn't make it into the official story." The blacksmith's hammer froze in mid-swing. He glanced around the stable to make sure they were alone, then set his tools aside and wiped his hands on a leather apron. "You lawman?" he asked. "Just someone who doesn't like seeing innocent men hang," Jake replied. The blacksmith studied Jake's face for a long moment, apparently seeing something that satisfied him. "Name's Pete Davis," he said finally. "I've been shoeing horses and fixing wagon wheels in this town for 37 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened that night." Pete Davis had been working late in his shop, repairing a broken axle for a rancher who needed his wagon ready for an early morning departure. The livery stable sat on the outskirts of Millfield, close enough to the main roads to hear riders approaching from any direction. "About 11 o'clock that night, I heard horses moving fast on the canyon road," Pete explained. "Sounded like maybe a dozen animals, moving at a good clip. That was unusual because most folks don't drive cattle at night unless they're up to something they don't want seen." Jake felt his pulse quicken. Pete's account suggested that there had indeed been unusual activity on the night of Thomas's arrest, activity that supported the young man's claim about seeing cattle being moved illegally. "Did you see who was moving the cattle?" Jake asked. Pete shook his head. "Too dark, and they were too far away. But about an hour later, I heard a horse screaming like it was hurt bad. That sound carries a long way in the desert, especially at night when everything else is quiet." The injured horse would have been Thomas's mount. The animal that had gone down in what Kane claimed was a prairie dog hole. But Pete's timeline suggested that the cattle movement had occurred before Thomas's horse was injured, which supported the young man's story about investigating suspicious activity. "Anyone else hear the horses moving that night?" Jake asked. Doc Hayes was making a late call to the widow Morrison's place. Her arthritis was acting up bad, and she needed something for the pain. Pete glanced toward the center of town, where the doctor's office was located. "Doc came by here around midnight, said he'd seen riders heading toward the border with what looked like a small herd." This was the break Jake had been hoping for. If Doc Hayes had witnessed the cattle movement independently of Thomas Mitchell's testimony, it would provide crucial corroboration for the young man's version of events. "Did Doc Hayes testify at Mitchell's trial?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Pete's expression darkened. "Doc was never asked to testify. Sheriff Kane said there was no need for additional witnesses when the case was so clear-cut." He lowered his voice. "But Doc Hayes isn't the kind of man to keep quiet when he knows something important. If he didn't speak up at the trial, it's because someone convinced him to stay silent." The implication was clear. Charles Brennan's influence extended even to the town's medical professional, someone whose testimony might have saved Thomas Mitchell's life. Doc Hayes had been silenced through threats or pressure, leaving an innocent man to face execution alone. "Where might I find Doc Hayes this evening?" Jake asked. "He usually checks on Emma Mitchell around sunset," Pete replied. "Poor girl's been getting sicker ever since her brother was arrested. Doc says the stress is putting a strain on her heart that she can't handle much longer." Jake thanked Pete for the information and left the livery stable, his mind working through the implications of what he had learned. The case against Thomas Mitchell was built on lies and intimidation, but proving it would require witnesses willing to risk Charles Brennan's wrath by telling the truth. As Jake walked back toward the center of town, he noticed how the streets had emptied as the sun dropped lower in the sky. The few people still out and about moved quickly and avoided making eye contact, as if they were afraid of being seen talking to strangers. This was a community living in fear, controlled by a man who used economic pressure and violence to maintain his grip on power. The schoolhouse stood at the end of a tree-lined street, its white-painted walls and bell tower making it one of the more attractive buildings in Millfield. Behind it, as Mary Sullivan had indicated, was a small house with a garden that someone had worked hard to maintain despite the desert climate. Jake positioned himself across the street where he could observe both buildings without being obvious about it. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he saw a figure approaching the house on foot. Doc William Hayes was a tall, lean man in his mid-50s, with the kind of steady bearing that inspired confidence in his medical abilities. He carried a black leather bag and walked with the measured pace of someone who had made this journey many times before. But there was something in his posture that suggested weariness beyond simple physical fatigue. Jake waited until the doctor had disappeared into Emma Mitchell's house before crossing the street and approaching the front door. Through the windows he could see the warm glow of oil lamps and the shadows of two figures in conversation. He knocked gently on the door, not wanting to startle a woman who's already dealing with more stress than her heart could handle. "Who is it?" came a voice from inside, young and feminine but strained with worry. "My name is Jake Coleman, ma'am. I was hoping to speak with Doc Hayes about your brother's situation." There was a long pause, followed by the sound of hushed conversation. Finally, the door opened to reveal a young woman who would have been beautiful if not for the pallor of serious illness and the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. Emma Mitchell was small and delicate, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun and green eyes that held a combination of intelligence and desperation. She wore a plain brown dress that had been carefully mended in several places, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the doorframe for support. "You're the stranger who was asking questions at Mary's saloon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sheriff Kane's men have been watching the house all day. If they see you here, there'll be trouble." "I know," Jake replied. "But sometimes trouble is necessary when innocent people are in danger." Emma studied his face for a moment, then stepped aside to let him enter. The interior of the house was small but immaculately clean, with handmade furniture and bookshelves that testified to Emma's profession as a teacher. Doc Hayes stood near the fireplace, his medical bag open on a nearby table. "Mr. Coleman," the doctor said, his voice carefully neutral. "Emma tells me you've been inquiring about her brother's case." Jake removed his hat and closed the door behind him. "I have reason to believe that Thomas is innocent, and I think you know more about that night than you were allowed to testify about." Doc Hayes' jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Thomas Mitchell was tried and convicted by a jury of his peers. The case is closed. But Emma stepped forward, her eyes bright with desperate hope. "Doctor, please. If there's anything you know that might help Thomas, you have to speak up. He's going to die tomorrow morning for something he didn't do." The doctor looked between Jake and Emma, clearly torn between his desire to help and his fear of the consequences. "Even if I knew something," he said finally, "what good would it do now? The trial is over. The sentence has been passed. Speaking up now would only put more people in danger." Jake moved closer, his voice urgent but controlled. "Doc, I've talked to Pete Davis at the livery stable. He heard cattle moving on the canyon road that night, and he said you saw riders heading toward the border with a herd. That testimony could prove Thomas was telling the truth about what he witnessed." Doc Hayes' composure cracked slightly. "Pete Davis talks too much for his own good," he muttered. "And so do you, Mr. Coleman. This town isn't safe for people who ask inconvenient questions." Emma moved to stand between the two men, her small frame somehow commanding attention despite her obvious frailty. "Dr. Hayes, you've been treating me since I was a child. You know I've never asked you for anything beyond medical care. But I'm asking you now, as someone who's watched me grow up, as someone who's seen how much Thomas means to me. Please don't let him die when you have the power to save him." The plea broke something in Doc Hayes's professional reserve. His shoulders sagged, and he sank into a chair near the fireplace, suddenly looking every one of his 55 years. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said quietly. "Charles Brennan owns this town. He controls the bank that holds mortgage on half the businesses, including this house. He influences who gets work and who doesn't, who gets credit at the general store and who goes hungry. If I testify against his interests, Emma's medication becomes unavailable, her treatment gets delayed, and she dies as surely as if someone put a bullet in her." Emma knelt beside the doctor's chair, taking his hands in her own. "I'm dying anyway, doctor. You know my heart can't take much more of this stress. If Thomas hangs tomorrow, I won't survive the grief. At least this way, his death might mean something." Jake felt the weight of the moment, understanding that he was witnessing the kind of impossible choice that defined life in a town controlled by corruption. Doc Hayes was being asked to choose between his professional obligations and the safety of his patient, while Emma was prepared to sacrifice her own life to save her brother's. "There might be another way," Jake said carefully. "What if we could expose Brennan's men without directly implicating you in the testimony? What if we could find evidence that would speak for itself?" Doc Hayes looked up with interest. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that proves Thomas Mitchell was telling the truth about what he saw that night," Jake replied. "The kind that shows Brennan's own men were stealing from him and needed a scapegoat when the thefts became too obvious to ignore." Emma rose to her feet, swaying slightly with the effort. "How could we possibly find that kind of evidence? And even if we did, who would believe us against Charles Brennan's word?" Jake had been asking himself the same questions, but Pete Davis's information had given him an idea. If Brennan's men had been stealing cattle on a regular basis, there would be evidence of their activities beyond just that one night. There would be tracks, witnesses, maybe even documentation of cattle sales that didn't match Brennan's records. "Doc, you said you saw riders heading toward the border with cattle that night. Did you recognize any of the men?" Hayes hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I saw 3 riders I knew. Frank Morrison, Brennan's foreman, Carl Webb, one of his top hands, and a man named Rodriguez who sometimes works the border crossings." The names meant nothing to Jake, but the fact that Doc Hayes could identify specific individuals was encouraging. If these men had been involved in cattle theft, other people might have seen them as well. "Have you ever treated any of these men for injuries?" Jake asked. "Frank Morrison came to me about 2 months ago with a knife wound on his arm. Said he'd cut himself on barbed wire, but the wound was too clean for that. More like someone had slashed him in a fight." Has paused, thinking. "Carl Webb's been coming in for treatment of what he claims is arthritis, but his symptoms are more consistent with someone who's been handling a lot of cash. The skin irritation on his fingers, the way he favors his right hand when he thinks no one is looking." Jake felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Morrison's knife wound suggested he had been involved in violent confrontations, possibly with other cattle thieves or with honest ranchers who had discovered thefts. Webb's symptoms suggested he had been handling large amounts of money, more than a typical ranch hand would see in normal circumstances. "Is there anyone else who might have seen suspicious activity on other nights?" Jake asked. Emma spoke up unexpectedly. "Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house keeps strange hours because of her insomnia. She sits by her window most nights, watching the street. Thomas used to say she knew more about what happened in town after dark than the sheriff did." Doc Hayes nodded. "Martha Patterson has been my patient for 15 years. She's sharp as a tack, and she doesn't miss much of what goes on around here. Jake felt a surge of hope. If Mrs. Patterson had witnessed other instances of suspicious nighttime activity, her testimony might establish a pattern that would support Thomas's story. Combined with Doc Hayes's account of the cattle movement and Pete Davis's corroboration about the timing, they might have enough evidence to create reasonable doubt about Thomas's guilt. Would Mrs. Patterson be willing to testify about what she's seen? Jake asked. Martha Patterson is 82 years old and doesn't give a damn what Charles Brennan thinks of her. Doc Hayes replied with the first hint of humor Jake had heard from him. She's also got a tongue sharp enough to cut leather and a memory like a steel trap. If she's seen something suspicious, she'd tell anyone who asks. Emma's eyes lit up with the first genuine hope Jake had seen from her. Mrs. Patterson was Thomas's teacher when he was a boy. She's always had a soft spot for him, and she was furious when he was arrested. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house. Doc Hayes quickly extinguished the oil lamps, plunging the room into darkness as hoofbeats stopped outside Emma's front door. 3 riders, Jake whispered, peering through a gap in the curtains. All armed. A harsh voice called out from the darkness. We know you're in there, Hayes. Come out where we can see you and bring whoever's with you. Emma gripped Jake's arm, her fingers trembling with fear and weakness. It's Frank Morrison, she whispered. Brennan's foreman. He's the one who testified against Thomas. Jake drew his revolver and moved toward the window for a better view. Morrison sat his horse with the confidence of a man who was used to getting his way through intimidation. The 2 men with him flanked the front door, their own weapons visible in the moonlight. You've got 1 minute to come out peaceful-like, Morrison called. After that, we come in and drag you out. Doc Hayes moved toward the door, but Jake caught his arm. Don't go out there. They're not interested in conversation. If I don't go, they'll break down the door, Hayes replied. Emma can't handle that kind of stress. Jake looked at the young woman, seeing the truth in her pale face and labored breathing. The confrontation was already pushing her weakened heart beyond its limits, and the situation would only get worse if Morrison and his men forced their way into the house. There's a back door, Emma whispered. It leads to the garden. You might be able to get away without being seen. Jake shook his head. I'm not running away and leaving you two to face this alone. Time's up. Morrison shouted. We're coming in. The sound of boots on the wooden porch was followed by the crash of the front door being kicked open. Jake pushed Emma behind the couch and took position beside the doorway, his gun ready as the first man entered the dark room. Morrison's silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by moonlight streaming through the broken door. He held a rifle in his hands and moved with the careful precision of an experienced gunfighter. I know you're in here, Morrison said, his voice echoing in the small room. Hayes, you old fool, you should have minded your own business. And whoever you are, stranger, you picked the wrong town to play hero in. Jake remained motionless, hoping Morrison's eyes hadn't adjusted to the darkness yet. The element of surprise was his only advantage against 3 armed men, and he would only get one chance to use it effectively. Morrison took another step into the room, his rifle sweeping in search of targets. Light a lamp, he called to his companions. Let's see what we're dealing with. The scrape of a match being struck came from behind Morrison, and Jake knew he was running out of time. In seconds, the room would be illuminated and his position would be exposed. He had to act now or lose any chance of protecting Doc Hayes and Emma. As the match flared to life, Jake stepped out from behind the doorway and pressed the barrel of his revolver against Morrison's neck. Drop the rifle, Jake said quietly. Tell your men to back away from the door. Morrison froze, the rifle still in his hands. You're making a big mistake, stranger. Charles Brennan doesn't forget people who interfere with his business. Maybe not, Jake replied. But Thomas Mitchell won't forget people who let him hang for something he didn't do. He pressed the gun harder against Morrison's throat. Drop the rifle, or I'll drop you right here." Morrison hesitated for a moment longer, then let the rifle fall to the floor with a clatter. "Boys, back away from the door," he called to his companions. "We've got ourselves a standoff." Jake could hear the other two men moving outside, probably positioning themselves for a better angle of attack. He needed to end this confrontation quickly before it escalated into a gunfight that would put Emma and Doc Hayes in even greater danger. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the broken doorway. "You and your men are going to mount up and ride back to town. Tomorrow morning, you're going to tell Charles Brennan that there are people in Millfield who know the truth about Thomas Mitchell, and if anything happens to him, that truth is going to become public knowledge." Morrison laughed harshly. "You think Brennan's going to call off a hanging because some drifter makes threats? You don't know who you're dealing with." "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But I know exactly who Thomas Mitchell is dealing with. Thieves and liars who frame innocent men to cover up their own crimes." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Jake could feel Morrison's body tense with anger. The foreman was probably armed with more than just the rifle, and desperate men made dangerous opponents. "You can't prove anything," Morrison snarled. "Mitchell's story about seeing us steal cattle is just the desperate lie of a condemned man." Jake smiled grimly in the darkness. Morrison had just confirmed Thomas's version of events, admitting that the young man had indeed seen something that night. It wasn't enough to free Thomas, but it was a start. "Maybe I can't prove it," Jake sighed. "But Doc Hayes saw you driving cattle toward the border, and Pete Davis heard you moving them. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house has been watching suspicious nighttime activity for months. How many witnesses do you think it takes to establish a pattern?" Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. "Those people won't testify. They know better than to cross Charles Brennan." "We'll see about that," Jake replied. "But right now, you and your men are leaving. If I see you near this house again tonight, I'll assume you're here to hurt innocent people, and I'll respond accordingly." For a long moment, Morrison remained motionless, weighing his options. Then, slowly, he raised his hands and stepped toward the door. "This isn't over," he said as he reached the threshold. "Brennan will hear about this, and he won't let it stand." "Tell Brennan that Thomas Mitchell has friends he didn't know about," Jake replied. "And tell him those friends aren't going to let an innocent man hang without a fight." Morrison disappeared through the doorway, and Jake heard him calling to his companions. Within moments, the sound of departing hoofbeats indicated that the immediate threat had passed, but Jake knew the confrontation had only raised the stakes for everyone involved. Doc Hayes relit one of the oil lamps, and Jake could see Emma sitting on the couch, her face pale but determined. The stress of the confrontation had clearly taken a toll on her weakened heart, but there was something in her expression that suggested she had found new strength in seeing someone willing to stand up to Brennan's men. "They'll be back," Doc Hayes said grimly. "Probably with more men next time." "Then we need to move fast," Jake replied. "How quickly can you get word to Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house? If she's willing to testify about what she's seen, we might be able to create enough doubt to delay the hanging." Emma struggled to her feet, swaying slightly with the effort. "Mrs. Patterson will help if she can, but getting her testimony won't be enough. We need proof, something that shows Morrison and the others have been stealing cattle all along." Jake holstered his revolver and began pacing the small room, his mind working through the possibilities. Morrison's admission that Thomas had seen them stealing cattle was crucial, but it needed to be corroborated by physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "Doc, you said Carl Webb has been coming to you for treatment of symptoms that suggest he's been handling a lot of money. Where would ranch hands like Webb and Morrison hide stolen money in a town like Millfield?" Hayes considered the question carefully. Most of the businesses in town use Brennan's bank for their deposits, so they couldn't hide money there without Brennan finding out. But there are a few places that deal in cash, and don't ask too many questions about where it comes from. Emma moved to a small desk near the window and withdrew a piece of paper and a pencil. Despite her obvious weakness, her movements were precise and purposeful as she began writing. Mrs. Patterson keeps detailed records of everything she observes from her window, Emma said. She's been writing it all down in a journal for years, including dates and times. If she's witnessed suspicious activity involving Brennan's men, it would all be documented. Jake felt a surge of excitement. Written records would carry more weight than verbal testimony, especially if they established a pattern of behavior that supported Thomas's story. Mrs. Patterson's journal might be the key to proving the young man's innocence. How do we get access to Mrs. Patterson's journal? Jake asked. We ask her, Emma replied simply. Martha Patterson taught half the people in this town, including Thomas and me. She's not afraid of Charles Brennan, and she doesn't tolerate injustice. Doc Hayes moved to Emma's side, checking her pulse with professional concern. Emma, you're pushing yourself too hard. Your heart can't take much more of this stress. Emma pulled her hand away gently but firmly. My heart will have to endure whatever it takes to save my brother, she said. I can rest after Thomas is free. The determination in her voice reminded Jake of his own sister, who had died trying to save their family ranch while he was away fighting in the war. Emma Mitchell had the same fierce loyalty that had driven Sarah Coleman to sacrifice everything for the people she loved. All right, Jake said, making his decision. Doc, I need you to arrange a meeting with Mrs. Patterson first thing in the morning. Emma, I want you to make a list of everyone in town who might have seen or heard something suspicious. We're going to gather every piece of evidence we can find and present it all at once. Hayes looked skeptical. Presented to whom? Sheriff. Kane won't listen, and Judge Morrison is Brennan's cousin. The whole legal system in this county is corrupt. Then we'll go over their heads, Jake replied. The territorial governor has to approve executions for cattle theft. If we can get evidence to him before the hanging, he might be willing to grant a stay until the case can be properly investigated. Emma's eyes widened with hope. The territorial capital is a 2-day ride from here. Even with our fastest horse, there wouldn't be time to reach the governor and get back before tomorrow morning. Jake had already thought of that problem and come up with a possible solution. There's a telegraph office in Silver Creek, about 6 hours' ride northeast of here. If we can get our evidence together tonight, someone could ride to Silver Creek and wire the governor's office directly. Doc Hayes shook his head. Silver Creek's telegraph office closes at sunset, and it doesn't open again until 8 in the morning. That still wouldn't give us enough time. The obstacle seemed insurmountable, but Jake refused to give up. There had to be a way to get word to someone with the authority to stop Thomas's execution, even if it meant taking desperate measures. What about the fort? Jake asked. Pete Davis mentioned a military tracker. If there's an army post nearby, they might have their own telegraph equipment. Fort Silverton is about 4 hours southeast of here, Hayes replied. They do have telegraph equipment, but military communications are restricted to official business. Emma stood up suddenly, her face flushed with excitement despite her obvious fatigue. Captain Morrison at Fort Silverton is Frank Morrison's brother, but he's an honorable man. He and Thomas served together briefly in the territorial militia, and he knows Thomas's character. Jake felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. If Captain Morrison was willing to help, he might have both the authority and the equipment needed to contact higher authorities about Thomas's case. Would Captain Morrison be willing to send a telegraph on Thomas's behalf? Jake asked. If he believed Thomas was innocent, yes, Emma replied. But he would need compelling evidence, not just our word against Charles Brennan's. Jake looked around the small house, taking inventory of their resources and options. They had several potential witnesses, the possibility of documentary evidence from Mrs. Patterson's journal, and a potential ally at Fort Silverton who might be willing to help. It wasn't much, but it might be enough if they could pull everything together quickly. "Here's what we're going to do," Jake said, his voice filled with new determination. "Doc, you and Emma are going to visit Mrs. Patterson first thing in the morning and get access to her journal. I'm going to ride to Fort Silverton tonight and talk to Captain Morrison about sending a telegraph to the territorial governor." Doc Hayes looked alarmed. "Jake, riding to the fort at night is dangerous even under normal circumstances. With Brennan's men looking for you, it could be suicide." "It's our only chance," Jake replied. "If we wait until morning, Thomas will be dead before we can get help." Emma moved to a closet near the back door and withdrew a heavy coat and a small leather pouch. "Take this," she said, offering Jake the pouch. "It's all the money Thomas and I have saved. Use it to pay for telegraphs or anything else you need." Jake hesitated to take money from people who clearly had very little, but Emma pressed the pouch into his hands with surprising strength. "Please," she said, "let us help save Thomas. It's the only thing we can do." Jake pocketed the money and moved toward the back door, checking his weapons and supplies. The ride to Fort Silverton would be treacherous in the dark, especially with Brennan's men potentially waiting in ambush along the way. "If I don't make it back by dawn," he told Doc Hayes, "go ahead with your plan to document Mrs. Patterson's observations. Even if we can't stop the hanging, we might be able to expose the truth afterward." Emma caught his arm as he reached for the door handle. "Mr. Coleman, why are you doing this for people you barely know?" Jake paused at the doorway, Emma's question hanging in the air between them like a challenge to his soul. The simple inquiry demanded an honest answer, one that would require him to confront truths he'd been avoiding for years. "Because I once stood by and watched injustice happen to my own family," he said finally. "And I've been running from that failure ever since." Emma's grip on his arm tightened, her green eyes searching his face in the lamplight. "What happened?" Jake glanced toward Doc Hayes, who was discreetly checking his medical supplies, giving them a moment of privacy. The story was one Jake had never told in full to anyone, but something about Emma's courage in the face of overwhelming odds compelled him to speak. "My family had a ranch in Colorado, nothing grand but enough to support my parents and my younger sister Sarah. When the war came, I enlisted and left Sarah to help manage things while I was gone." His voice grew quiet with old pain. "While I was away, a railroad company decided they wanted our land for a depot. They made my father an offer that was more like a threat. Then when he refused, they had him arrested on trumped-up charges of cattle theft." Emma's face paled with recognition. The parallels between Thomas's situation and Jake's family tragedy were unmistakable, down to the false accusations and the powerful interests working behind the scenes. "Sarah tried to fight the charges, hired a lawyer with money we didn't have, gathered witnesses who could testify to my father's character. But the railroad had judges and sheriffs in their pocket, just like Brennan has here." Jake's hands clenched into fists as the memories resurged. "By the time I got word and made it home, my father was dead in jail, supposedly from a heart attack. Sarah had lost the ranch trying to pay legal fees, and she was dying of consumption brought on by the stress and poverty." Doc Hayes looked up from his medical bag, understanding dawning in his expression. "She died before you could help her. She died believing I had abandoned the family when they needed me most," Jake replied. "And maybe she was right. Maybe if I had stayed home instead of going off to play soldier, I could have protected them from the railroad schemes." Emma released his arm and stepped back, her own hand moving unconsciously to her chest where her damaged heart struggled to maintain its rhythm. "But you're here now, trying to protect Thomas and me. That has to count for something, does it?" Jake asked. "Or am I just trying to ease my conscience by rescuing strangers when I couldn't save my own family?" The question had tormented Jake for years, driving him from town to town in a restless search for something that might fill the hollow space where his sense of purpose had once resided. He had told himself that avoiding entanglements was wisdom, that staying uninvolved was the safer path for everyone concerned. Doc Hayes moved closer, his weathered face showing the compassion that made him effective at treating not just physical ailments but the deeper wounds that people carried. "Jake, what happened to your family was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known what would happen while you were serving your country." "I could have come home when the first letter arrived asking for help," Jake replied. "Sarah wrote to me 3 times before the situation became desperate, but I was caught up in Army life and convinced that whatever problems they were facing could wait until the war ended." Emma sank into a chair near the fireplace. Her breathing labored from the emotional strain of the conversation. "Thomas almost didn't come home when our mother was dying," she said quietly. "He was working a cattle drive in Texas, making good money for the first time in his life. When word reached him that mother was sick, he had to choose between finishing the drive and earning enough to pay for her medicine, or coming home to be with her in her final days." Jake turned to face her fully, sensing that her story might hold insights that applied to his own situation. "What did he do?" "He came home," Emma replied. "He gave up 3 months' wages and rode hard for 2 weeks to reach Millfield in time to hold Mother's hand as she passed." Tears glistened in her eyes as she continued. "Thomas told me afterward that he would rather be poor and present than wealthy and absent. He said money could be earned again, but moments with family could never be recovered once they were lost." The wisdom in Thomas's choice highlighted the mistake Jake had made years earlier, but it also suggested that his current actions might represent a form of redemption rather than mere guilt-driven compensation. "Your brother sounds like a man of principle," Jake observed. "He is," Emma agreed. "Which is why I know he's telling the truth about what he saw that night. Thomas would never steal cattle, but he would risk his life to expose theft if he witnessed it." Doc Hayes checked his pocket watch and moved toward the window, peering through the curtains at the moonlit street beyond. "It's nearly 9 o'clock. If you're going to reach Fort Silverton and get back before the hanging, you need to leave soon." Jake nodded, understanding that the time for reflection had passed and the moment for action had arrived. He moved toward the back door, then paused as Emma struggled to her feet once more. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice stronger despite her obvious physical weakness, "if something happens to you on the road tonight, I want you to know that your willingness to help us has already redeemed whatever failures you think you carry from the past." The simple forgiveness offered by a young woman who barely knew him struck Jake more powerfully than any sermon or philosophical argument could have. Emma Mitchell was facing the loss of her brother and her own declining health, yet she had found the grace to absolve a stranger of his self-imposed guilt. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll do everything I can to bring help back in time." Emma smiled, the expression transforming her pale features with surprising beauty. "I know you will. And I'll be praying that Captain Morrison proves to be as honorable as his reputation suggests." Jake touched the brim of his hat in farewell and slipped out through the back door into the cool desert night. The garden behind Emma's house was small but well tended, with vegetables and herbs growing in neat rows despite the challenging climate. A wooden gate led to an alley that ran behind the houses on the street, providing a route that would keep him hidden from any watchers positioned at the front of the building. The livery stable was dark when Jake reached it, but Pete Davis had told him to help himself to whatever he needed. Jake saddled a fresh horse, a sturdy roan gelding that looked capable of covering the distance to Fort Silverton without breaking down. His own mount had already endured a long day and deserved rest before the challenges that tomorrow would bring. As Jake led the horse from the stable, he noticed movement in the shadows across the street. 2 figures stood in the doorway of a close store, their postures suggesting they were watching rather than simply seeking shelter. Brennan's men had anticipated his next move and positioned themselves to intercept him before he could leave town. Jake swung into the saddle and urged the roan toward the back of the stable, where a narrow trail led into the desert. The path was barely visible in the moonlight, but it would take him away from Millfield without using the main roads where ambushes were most likely. The sound of pursuing hoofbeats reached him before he had covered half a mile. Jake turned in his saddle and counted at least 3 riders following his trail, their horses moving at a pace that suggested they were more interested in tracking than overtaking him immediately. They were probably hoping to follow him to his destination, then intercept any messages he might try to send rather than risk a confrontation in open country. The strategy was sound, but it assumed Jake would take the most direct route to Fort Silverton and follow predictable behavior patterns. Instead, Jake turned his horse toward a series of rocky outcroppings that rose from the desert floor like ancient monuments. The terrain would slow his progress, but make it nearly impossible for his pursuers to maintain visual contact without revealing their own positions. The roan picked its way carefully among the rocks, its hooves finding purchase on surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. Jake dismounted and led the animal through particularly treacherous passages, trusting his own feet more than the horse's when footing became uncertain. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as his trackers struggled to follow his route through the broken landscape. Their horses were probably better suited to open country riding than rock climbing, and their riders would be reluctant to risk injury in terrain they couldn't see clearly. After an hour of careful navigation through the rocky maze, Jake emerged onto a broad plateau that stretched toward the distant mountains. The elevation gave him a commanding view of the surrounding country, including the lights of Millfield twinkling several miles behind him. More importantly, he could see the campfire that marked the location of his pursuers. They had stopped at the base of the rock formation, apparently deciding that following him through the dangerous terrain at night was too risky to attempt. Jake remounted and urged the roan into a steady lope across the plateau, eating up the miles between himself and Fort Silverton with ground-covering efficiency. The moon was bright enough to illuminate major obstacles, and the horse seemed to have excellent night vision that complemented Jake's own experience with night travel. Fort Silverton appeared as a cluster of lights arranged in the geometric patterns typical of military installations. Guard towers marked the corners of the compound, and Jake could make out sentries walking their posts along the wooden palisade that enclosed the main buildings. As Jake approached the main gate, a challenge rang out from the nearest guard tower. "Halt! State your name and business." "Jake Coleman," he called back. "I need to speak with Captain Morrison about an urgent matter involving a citizen of Millfield." There was a brief conference among the guards before the gate swung open and Jake was escorted into the compound. Fort Silverton was larger than he had expected, with barracks, stables, and administrative buildings arranged around a central parade ground. Soldiers moved purposefully between the structures, suggesting that the post maintained a high state of readiness despite its remote location. Captain Morrison's office was located in the headquarters building, a substantial log structure that housed the post's administrative functions. Jake was shown to a waiting room furnished with simple wooden chairs and a desk where a clerk was finishing paperwork by lamplight. "Captain Morrison will see you shortly," the clerk informed him. He was just finishing his evening reports. Jake used the waiting time to organize his thoughts and prepare the most compelling argument possible for why a military officer should involve himself in what appeared to be a civilian legal matter. He needed to convince Captain Morrison that Thomas Mitchell's case represented more than just a local dispute, that it involved corruption that threatened the stability of the entire region. When the inner door opened, Jake found himself face to face with a man who bore a strong physical resemblance to Frank Morrison but carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command rather than intimidation. Captain Morrison was perhaps 35 years old, with the lean build and steady gaze of a professional soldier. "Mr. Coleman," the captain said, extending his hand in greeting. My clerk tells me you've ridden from Millfield tonight on urgent business. Please, have a seat and tell me what brings you here." Jake settled into the chair across from Captain Morrison's desk and launched into a concise explanation of Thomas Mitchell's situation, emphasizing the evidence that suggested the young man had been framed by his brother Frank Morrison and other members of Brennan's organization. Captain Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim as Jake described the corruption that had infected Millfield's legal system. When Jake finished his account, the captain leaned back in his chair and steepled, his fingers in contemplation. "Mr. Coleman, what you're describing amounts to a conspiracy involving cattle theft, perjury, and judicial corruption. These are serious charges that would require substantial evidence to substantiate." "I understand that, Captain. But an innocent man is going to hang in a few hours unless someone with authority intervenes. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything, just to help get word to the territorial governor so he can investigate before it's too late." Captain Morrison rose from his chair and walked to a window that looked out over the parade ground. "Thomas Mitchell served under me briefly when we were organizing militia units to deal with Apache raids. He struck me as an honest young man, not someone who would resort to cattle theft." Jake felt a surge of hope. If Captain Morrison had personal knowledge of Thomas's character, it might tip the balance in favor of intervention. "More troubling," the captain continued, "is your allegation about my brother Frank's involvement. Frank has always been ambitious and somewhat ruthless in pursuing his goals, but I wouldn't have thought him capable of framing an innocent man for a capital crime. Captain, with respect, desperate men do things they wouldn't normally consider. If your brother and his associates have been stealing cattle for months or years, they would need a scapegoat when the thefts became too obvious to ignore, Captain." Morrison returned to his desk and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, flipping through several pages before finding what he was looking for. 3 months ago, we received a report from a rancher near the Mexican border claiming that someone was driving stolen cattle through his property at night. He couldn't identify the thieves, but he was certain they were heading south toward the border crossings. Jake leaned forward with interest. "Did you investigate the report?" "We sent a patrol to the area, but they found no evidence of cattle theft. However, they did report seeing riders who claimed to work for Charles Brennan moving a small herd toward the border. The patrol leader accepted their explanation that they were delivering cattle to a legitimate buyer. The information confirmed Jake's suspicions about the scope of the theft operation. Brennan's men had been using his name and reputation to move stolen cattle across the border, probably keeping most of the profits for themselves while giving Brennan enough money to avoid suspicion. Captain, if your patrol can testify to seeing Brennan's men moving cattle toward the border, it would corroborate Thomas Mitchell's story about what he witnessed that night." Captain Morrison nodded slowly. "It would indeed. But more than that, it would suggest that Thomas stumbled onto an ongoing operation rather than attempting a single theft." He moved to a large map mounted on the wall and pointed to several locations marked with red pins. "We've had similar reports from 3 other ranchers in the past 6 months, all describing nighttime cattle movements in areas where Brennan's men were known to operate." Jake studied the map, noting how the locations formed a pattern that suggested systematic rather than random theft. "Has anyone reported these incidents to civilian authorities?" Sheriff Kane claimed to be investigating, but he never requested military assistance or asked for copies of our patrol reports. In hindsight, his lack of interest in cooperation seemed suspicious. The evidence was mounting that Thomas Mitchell had been caught up in something much larger than a simple cattle theft, but time was running short for organizing an effective response. "Captain, can you send a telegraph to the territorial governor requesting a stay of execution pending investigation?" Captain Morrison moved to another desk and withdrew a telegraph key and several blank message forms. "I can send an official Military communication, expressing concerns about possible corruption in civilian law enforcement. That might be enough to prompt gubernatorial intervention. Jake watched as the captain composed a carefully worded message, explaining the military's concerns about the Mitchell case and requesting territorial review of the evidence. The telegram was formal and diplomatic, but it made clear that federal military authorities had serious doubts about the integrity of local civilian justice. "How long will it take to get a response?" Jake asked as Captain Morrison prepared to send the message. "If the governor's staff is working late, we might hear back within a few hours. More likely, we'll get a response first thing in the morning." The captain paused, then added, "Either way, it won't arrive in time to stop the execution unless someone delays it locally." Jake had feared that would be the case, but he had hoped that military intervention might carry enough weight to force postponement. Is there any other authority that might be able to order a delay? The territorial marshal has that power, but Marshal Collins is in Santa Fe dealing with a bank robbery case. He won't be back in the region for several days. Captain Morrison finished encoding his message and began tapping it out on the telegraph key. However, if substantial new evidence surfaces that casts doubt on Mitchell's guilt, even Sheriff Kane would be hard-pressed to proceed with the execution without risking federal investigation. The key was evidence, the same obstacle Jake had been confronting since arriving in Millfield. Mrs. Patterson's journal might provide documentation of suspicious activity, but it wouldn't be enough by itself to prove Thomas's innocence or his captor's guilt. "Captain, you mentioned patrol reports documenting cattle movements in areas where your brother operates. Would those reports be available as evidence if needed?" "They're official military documents, but they could be released to territorial authorities investigating civilian crimes." Captain Morrison finished sending his telegram and turned back to Jake. However, getting those documents to Millfield by morning would be impossible through normal channels. Jake felt the frustration of time running out and options dwindling. Every potential solution seemed to require more hours than remained before. Thomas Mitchell's scheduled execution. What if someone rode back to Millfield tonight with copies of the relevant patrol reports? Jake asked. Would that be possible? Captain Morrison considered the proposal. It's highly irregular, but given the circumstances, I might be able to justify providing copies of reports that document suspicious activity in civilian areas. He moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew several folders. These contained statements from patrol leaders who observed nighttime cattle movements, including specific dates, times, and descriptions of the individuals involved. Jake examined the documents quickly, recognizing names and descriptions that matched what he had learned in Millfield. Frank Morrison was mentioned specifically in 2 reports, along with Carl Webb and several other men who worked for Brennan. This proves that Thomas Mitchell was telling the truth about seeing organized cattle theft, Jake said with excitement. These patrol reports document the same kind of activity he claimed to witness. More than that, Captain Morrison replied. They establish a timeline that shows the thefts were occurring regularly over a period of months. If Mitchell had been involved in the operation, he would have been observed by our patrols during previous incidents. The logic was compelling, but Jake knew that logic alone wouldn't be enough to convince corrupt officials who had already committed to a particular version of events. The evidence would need to be presented in a way that made it impossible for Sheriff Kane or Judge Morrison to ignore without exposing themselves to federal scrutiny. Captain, if I rode back to Millfield with these documents, would you be willing to follow up with additional military personnel to ensure that the evidence receives proper consideration? Captain Morrison moved to his desk and began writing orders on official stationery. Mr. Coleman, I'm authorizing you to carry copies of relevant patrol reports to civilian authorities in Millfield, with instructions that they be given full consideration in evaluating the Mitchell case. He signed the orders with a flourish and affixed the fort's official seal. Furthermore, I'm dispatching a squad of soldiers to Millfield to observe the proceedings and report back on how the evidence is received. Jake felt a surge of gratitude and relief. Military oversight would make it much more difficult for corrupt officials to simply ignore inconvenient evidence or retaliate against witnesses who came forward. "How soon can your soldiers reach Millfield?" Jake asked. "They'll leave at first. Light and should arrive well before the scheduled execution. Sergeant Martinez is leading the detail, and he's been instructed to ensure that all evidence receives proper evaluation before any irreversible actions are taken." Jake gathered the documents and prepared to depart, acutely aware that he faced a hard ride through potentially hostile territory with crucial evidence that could save an innocent man's life. "Captain, there's one more thing. Your brother Frank and his associates tried to intimidate witnesses earlier tonight. If they realize that military documents are being brought into evidence against them, they might try to prevent those documents from reaching Millfield." Captain Morrison's expression darkened with anger and disappointment. Frank has always pushed boundaries, but if he's truly involved in framing an innocent man, he'll face the consequences of his actions. He moved to a weapons cabinet and withdrew a rifle and ammunition. "Take this. If anyone tries to stop you from delivering that evidence, you have my authorization to defend yourself." Jake accepted the weapon gratefully, checking its action and loading it with practiced efficiency. The rifle was a newer model than his own weapons, with better range and accuracy that might prove crucial if he encountered hostile forces on the return journey. "Thank you, Captain, for everything." Captain Morrison extended his hand once more. "Just make sure that evidence reaches the right people. If Thomas Mitchell is truly innocent, then justice demands that he be freed and the real criminals be punished." Jake shook the captain's hand firmly, then gathered his gear and headed for the stable where his horse was being fed and watered. The return journey would be even more dangerous than the ride to Fort Silverton, since Frank Morrison and his men would be expecting Jake to return and might have laid ambushes along the most likely routes. As Jake saddled the roan gelding, he noticed that several soldiers were preparing their own mounts for early morning departure. Sergeant Martinez approached and introduced himself, a competent-looking non-commissioned officer with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling difficult assignments. "Mr. Coleman, the captain filled me in on the situation in Millfield. My men and I will be riding out at dawn to observe the proceedings and ensure that military evidence receives proper consideration." Jake appreciated the professional support, but he knew that military intervention could only be effective if the evidence reached Millfield before corrupt officials found ways to suppress or discredit it. "Sergeant, there's a good chance that Sheriff Kane and his associates will try to prevent a fair evaluation of the evidence. They have too much invested in their version of events to allow it to be contradicted now." Sergeant Martinez nodded grimly. "We've dealt with corrupt local officials before. The key is making sure that federal authority is clearly established and that any attempts at obstruction are documented for higher authorities." Jake mounted his horse and checked that the military documents were securely fastened in his saddlebags. The patrol reports and Captain Morrison's official orders represented Thomas Mitchell's best hope for survival, but only if they could be delivered and presented effectively. "I'll see you in Millfield, Sergeant, hopefully with enough time to prevent a grave injustice." Jake rode out of Fort Silverton at a fast trot, pushing the roan hard enough to make good time, but not so hard as to exhaust the animal before reaching his destination. The moon was beginning to set, and he estimated that he had perhaps 4 hours before dawn brought both the military patrol and Thomas Mitchell's appointment with the gallows. The return journey took Jake through different terrain than his outbound route, staying closer to established trails that would allow faster travel despite the increased risk of ambush. He needed speed more than stealth now, since the evidence he carried would be worthless if it arrived too late to affect the outcome. As Jake crested a hill overlooking the approaches to Millfield, He spotted the glow of campfires in the distance. Someone was waiting for him, probably the same men who had attempted to follow him earlier in the evening. Jake dismounted and studied the terrain ahead, looking for alternative routes that might allow him to bypass the ambush sites. The countryside was relatively open, with few natural features that would provide concealment for a rider trying to avoid detection. Instead of attempting to sneak around the waiting men, Jake decided on a more direct approach. He remounted and urged the roan into a full gallop, charging straight toward the nearest campfire with the military rifle ready in his hands. The sudden attack caught Frank Morrison's men by surprise. They had been expecting Jake to approach cautiously, trying to slip past their positions under cover of darkness. Instead, he burst into their camp like an avenging spirit, scattering their horses and sending the men diving for cover behind rocks and scrub brush. Jake didn't stop to fight, but continued his headlong charge toward Millfield, leaving the confused and temporarily horseless ambushers behind. By the time they could organize pursuit, he would be in town and under whatever protection Doc Hayes and Emma Mitchell could provide. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn as Jake rode into Millfield's main street. The town was still mostly asleep, but he could see activity around the sheriff's office and the courthouse that suggested preparations for the morning's execution were already underway. Jake rode directly to Emma Mitchell's house, where lamplight in the windows indicated that she and Doc Hayes were awake and waiting. As he dismounted and approached the front door, Emma appeared on the porch, her face pale with exhaustion but bright with desperate hope. "Did you reach Captain Morrison?" she asked. "Were you able to send word to the territorial governor?" Jake patted the saddlebags containing the military documents. "Better than that. I have evidence that proves Thomas was telling the truth. And military personnel are on their way to ensure it gets proper consideration." For the first time since Jake had met her, Emma Mitchell smiled with genuine joy rather than desperate determination. The expression transformed her features completely, showing glimpses of the vibrant young woman she might have been under different circumstances. "Thank God," she whispered. "And thank you, Mr. Coleman. You've given us hope when we had none left." Jake followed Emma into the house where Doc Hayes was waiting with Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman whose sharp eyes and determined expression suggested she would indeed prove to be a formidable witness for the defense. "Mrs. Patterson has been telling me about her observations," Doc Hayes reported. "Jake, this woman has documented enough criminal activity to put half of Brennan's organization in prison." Mrs. Patterson looked up from a thick journal filled with her careful handwriting. "Young man, I've been watching suspicious activities in this town for months, and I've written down every detail. Frank Morrison and his associates have been conducting nighttime business that no honest cattleman would need to hide." Jake felt the pieces of Thomas Mitchell's defense finally coming together. Military documentation, eyewitness accounts, medical testimony, and Mrs. Patterson's detailed records created a body of evidence that even corrupt officials would find difficult to dismiss. "How much time do we have before the execution?" Jake asked. Emma checked the clock on the mantelpiece. "About 2 hours. The hanging is scheduled for 8 o'clock, just after sunrise." Jake opened his saddlebags and withdrew the military documents, spreading them on Emma's kitchen table for examination. "These are official Army patrol reports documenting the same kind of cattle theft activity that Thomas witnessed. They prove he was telling the truth about seeing organized criminal operations." Doc Hayes examined the documents with growing excitement. "Jake, this is exactly what we needed. Official military records that corroborate Thomas's testimony and establish that the cattle theft was an ongoing operation rather than a single incident." Mrs. Patterson looked over the patrol reports with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence. "These dates match activities I recorded in my journal. On 3 separate occasions, I observed men matching these descriptions moving through town late at night, always heading in the direction of the border crossings. Emma sank into a chair near the fireplace, overcome with relief and exhaustion. "We actually have a chance to save Thomas," she said wonderingly. "After all these weeks of feeling helpless, we finally have a chance to prove his innocence." Jake felt a deep satisfaction at seeing hope replace despair in the young woman's eyes, but he knew their work was far from finished. Having evidence was one thing, but getting it properly presented and evaluated would require careful strategy and flawless execution. "Doc, can you get word to Sheriff Kane that new evidence has surfaced in the Mitchell case?" "Military evidence. That requires his immediate attention before any execution can proceed?" Hayes nodded. "I can do better than that. As the town's only physician, I have the authority to declare a medical emergency if I believe Emma's condition would be worsened by witnessing her brother's execution. That would give us grounds to request a delay while the evidence is evaluated." The plan was taking shape, but Jake knew they would face fierce resistance from officials who had invested too much in their false narrative to abandon it easily. Charles Brennan and his associates would fight desperately to prevent the truth from coming out. "Mrs. Patterson, would you be willing to testify publicly about what you've observed and recorded?" The elderly woman straightened her shoulders with fierce determination. "Young man, I've been waiting my whole life for the chance to expose the corruption in this town. If my testimony can save that boy's life, then I'll speak my piece and let the chips fall where they may." As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through Emma's windows, Jake heard the distant sound of horses approaching Millfield. The glass, he could see a military patrol riding down the main street with Sergeant Martinez in the lead. "The cavalry has arrived," Jake announced with satisfaction. "Now let's go save Thomas Mitchell." The morning air carried the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks as Millfield awakened to what many expected would be its most significant day in years. Jake watched through Emma's window as townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, some heading toward the town square where the gallows waited like a grim monument to justice perverted. Sergeant Martinez and his patrol had taken positions around the courthouse, their blue uniforms and military bearing creating an obvious federal presence that made Sheriff Kane visibly nervous. Jake could see the lawman pacing back and forth in front of his office, repeatedly glancing toward the soldiers as if trying to calculate how their presence might affect his carefully laid plans. "We need to move quickly," Jake said, gathering the military documents and Mrs. Patterson's journal. "Kane will try to rush the execution before we can present the evidence properly." Emma struggled to her feet, her determination overriding the obvious weakness that had plagued her throughout the ordeal. "I'm coming with you. Thomas needs to see that his sister believes in his innocence." Doc Hayes moved to support Emma's elbow, his medical training evident in the way he assessed her condition with a glance. "Emma, the stress of a public confrontation could trigger a crisis with your heart. You should stay here where I can monitor your condition." "My heart will stop from grief if Thomas dies believing no one fought for him," Emma replied with quiet steel in her voice. "I'd rather risk everything trying to save him than live safely knowing I could have helped but chose not to." Jake recognized the fierce loyalty that had driven his own sister to sacrifice everything for their family. Emma Mitchell possessed the same unbreakable spirit that refused to abandon loved ones regardless of personal cost. Mrs. Patterson closed her journal and tucked it under her arm with the authority of someone accustomed to having her words carry weight. "Young woman, I've been documenting corruption in this town for longer than you've been alive. If we're going to expose Charles Brennan's organization, we need to do it publicly where everyone can witness the truth." The group prepared to leave Emma's house, each carrying evidence that could transform Thomas Mitchell from condemned criminal to vindicated victim. Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but this time it was tempered by the support of allies who shared his commitment to justice. As they stepped onto the front porch, Jake noticed that Frank Morrison and several of his men had positioned themselves across the street, their hostile stares making their intentions clear. They wouldn't attempt violence with military personnel present, but their presence served as a reminder that powerful interests opposed any effort to expose the truth. "Stay close together," Jake instructed. "Don't give them any opportunity to separate us or interfere with the evidence." The walk to the courthouse felt like a march through enemy territory, with suspicious faces watching from windows and doorways. Some townspeople seemed genuinely curious about the unusual activity, but others appeared to have been warned to keep their distance from anyone challenging the official narrative. Sheriff Kane met them at the courthouse steps, his face flushed with anger and his hand resting conspicuously on his gun belt. "What's all this about, Hayes?" "The execution is scheduled for 8 o'clock, and I don't intend to let anybody delay justice with last-minute theatrics." Doc Hayes stepped forward with professional authority. "Sheriff, new evidence has emerged that casts serious doubt on Thomas Mitchell's guilt. As a medical professional and concerned citizen, I'm requesting that the execution be postponed until this evidence can be properly evaluated." Kane's eyes flicked toward the military patrol, clearly calculating whether he could simply ignore the request. "What kind of evidence?" "Mitchell had his trial, and the jury reached their verdict. The case is closed." Jake produced the official military documents, holding them where Kane could see the Army seals and signatures. "These are patrol reports from Fort Silverton, documenting organized cattle theft in the exact area and time frame where Thomas claimed to witness criminal activity. They corroborate his testimony and prove he was telling the truth." Kane's complexion paled as he recognized the implications of official military involvement. Federal documentation couldn't be dismissed as easily as civilian testimony, especially with Army personnel present to ensure proper consideration. "Let me see those documents," Kane demanded, reaching for the papers. Jake pulled them back, keeping them safely out of reach. "These documents will be presented to proper judicial authority, not confiscated by local officials with potential conflicts of interest." The standoff attracted attention from townspeople gathering in the square, some drawn by curiosity about the military presence and others apparently summoned by messages from interested parties. Jake noticed Charles Brennan himself approaching from the direction of the bank, his expensive clothes and imperious bearing marking him as a man accustomed to controlling events rather than merely observing them. Sergeant Martinez approached the group, his military bearing commanding respect even from hostile civilians. "Sheriff Kane, I've been ordered by Captain Morrison to observe these proceedings and ensure that all evidence receives proper evaluation before any irreversible actions are taken." Kane's jaw clenched with frustration. "Sergeant, this is a civilian matter under local jurisdiction. The Army has no authority to interfere with legal proceedings conducted by properly constituted courts." "That's correct, Sheriff," Martinez agreed. "However, the Army does have authority to ensure that military evidence is given appropriate consideration when it relates to civilian criminal cases. These documents contain official patrol reports that may be relevant to the Mitchell case." Charles Brennan reached the courthouse steps, his pale eyes taking in the confrontation with the calculating attention of a man assessing threats to his interests. He was older than Jake had expected, perhaps 60 years old, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never faced serious opposition to his will. "What seems to be the problem here, Sheriff?" Brennan asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. Kane gestured toward Jake and his companions. "These people are trying to disrupt a legal execution with claims about new evidence. I've told them the case is closed, and the sentence will be carried out as scheduled." Brennan's gaze settled on Emma, and Jake saw something cold and predatory in the cattle baron's expression. "Miss Mitchell, I understand your desire to save your brother, but false hope is crueler than accepting reality. Thomas committed a serious crime against my property, and he must face the consequences of his actions." Emma lifted her chin defiantly despite her obvious physical weakness. "Mr. Brennan, my brother is innocent of the charges against him. The real thieves are men who work for you, stealing your cattle while using your name to cover their crimes." The accusation hung in the morning air like a challenge, drawing surprised murmurs from townspeople who had gathered to watch the proceedings. Few people had ever dared to directly confront Charles Brennan with allegations of criminal activity involving his organization. Brennan's expression hardened with anger. "Young woman, you're distraught over your brother's situation, but that doesn't excuse making slanderous accusations against honest businessmen. I suggest you withdraw those remarks before you find yourself facing legal consequences of your own." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her journal clutched in her weathered hands like a weapon. "Charles Brennan, I've been documenting suspicious activities involving your men for months. Night after night, I've watched Frank Morrison and others conducting business that no legitimate cattleman would need to hide." The elderly woman's intervention clearly surprised Brennan, who had probably dismissed her as a harmless busybody whose observations carried no weight with serious adults. "Martha Patterson, you're a lonely old woman who sees conspiracies in perfectly normal business activities. I suggest you return to your boarding house and leave legal matters to people qualified to handle them." Mrs. Patterson's eyes flashed with indignation. "I may be old, Charles Brennan, but I'm not blind or foolish. I know the difference between legitimate business and criminal conspiracy, and I've documented enough evidence to expose the truth about your organization." Jake sensed the moment had arrived to present their evidence publicly, where the entire town could witness the facts that proved Thomas Mitchell's innocence. He stepped forward, holding the military documents where everyone could see them. "These are official Army patrol reports, documenting cattle theft activities in the same area where Thomas Mitchell claimed to witness criminal behavior. The reports identify specific individuals, including Frank Morrison, conducting nighttime cattle movements toward the Mexican border." A ripple of surprise moved through the gathered crowd. Many townspeople had heard rumors about irregular activities involving Brennan's organization, but few had expected those rumors to be supported by official military documentation. Frank Morrison pushed through the crowd, his face dark with anger and what might have been fear. "Those documents are forgeries," he declared loudly. "Someone's trying to frame honest cattlemen with fake evidence." Sergeant Martinez moved too. Stand beside Jake, his military authority lending weight to the authenticity of the documents. "These are official Army records, properly signed and sealed by commanding officers at Fort Silverton. Anyone questioning their authenticity can verify them through proper military channels." The crowd grew larger as word spread through Millfield about the confrontation taking place at the courthouse. Jake noticed that many faces showed genuine surprise at the allegations being made, suggesting that most townspeople had accepted the official version of Thomas Mitchell's guilt without question. Judge Morrison appeared at the courthouse entrance, his robes billowing dramatically as he surveyed the scene before him. As Charles Brennan's cousin, he had presided over Thomas's trial with obvious bias, but the presence of military personnel and federal evidence complicated his position considerably. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Judge Morrison demanded. "The execution is scheduled to proceed in 30 minutes, and I won't tolerate any disruptions to the legal process." Doc Hayes stepped forward with professional dignity. "Your Honor, new evidence has emerged that was not available during the original trial. This evidence directly contradicts the testimony that led to Thomas Mitchell's conviction." Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed as he recognized the threat posed by official military documentation. Unlike Sheriff Kane, who could simply ignore inconvenient evidence, a judge faced potential federal oversight if he failed to properly consider relevant materials. "What kind of evidence?" the judge asked reluctantly. Jake held up the patrol reports once more. Official Army records documenting the same criminal activities that Thomas Mitchell testified to witnessing. These documents prove he was telling the truth about organized cattle theft involving your cousin's employees. The direct reference to Judge Morrison's family connection to Charles Brennan drew gasps from the crowd. While everyone in town knew about the relationship, few people had ever been bold enough to mention it publicly in connection with legal proceedings. Judge Morrison's face flushed red with anger. "That's enough. I won't allow this court to be disrupted by desperate attempts to overturn a properly reached verdict. The execution will proceed as scheduled." Emma stepped forward, her small frame somehow commanding attention despite her obvious frailty. "Your Honor, my brother is innocent of the crimes charged against him. If you allow him to be executed, when evidence of his innocence exists, you'll be committing murder under color of law." The accusation struck the crowd like lightning, and Jake could see shocked recognition on many faces. Emma Mitchell had just publicly accused a sitting judge of potential murder, a charge that would carry serious consequences if she was wrong, but would expose massive corruption if she was right. Judge Morrison struggled to maintain his composure in the face of such a direct challenge to his authority. "Miss Mitchell, you're obviously distraught, but that doesn't excuse contempt of court. Sheriff Kane, remove these people from the courthouse grounds immediately." Kane moved toward Emma with obvious reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with physically restraining a sick young woman in front of so many witnesses. Before he could reach her, Sergeant Martinez stepped between them. "Sheriff, I have orders to ensure that military evidence receives proper consideration. Until that evidence has been evaluated by appropriate judicial authority, I must insist that no irreversible actions be taken." The confrontation between civilian and military authority created a tense standoff that could escalate into serious conflict if not resolved carefully. Jake recognized that they had reached the crucial moment when all their evidence and preparation would either succeed in saving Thomas Mitchell or fail spectacularly. "Judge Morrison," Jake said loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear, "you have a choice to make. You can ignore federal evidence and proceed with an execution that may be murdering an innocent man, or you can postpone the proceedings until the truth can be properly determined." The judge's response would reveal whether Millfield's legal system retained any integrity or had been completely corrupted by Charles Brennan's influence. Judge Morrison looked around the crowd, clearly calculating the political consequences of various courses of action. The presence of military personnel and the serious nature of the evidence made it difficult to simply dismiss the challenge, but accepting it would expose his own involvement in a potentially corrupt process. "Very well," the judge said finally. "I'll examine this alleged evidence in my chambers. But I warn you, if this proves to be a frivolous attempt to delay justice, there will be serious consequences for everyone involved." Charles Brennan stepped forward, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a man issuing orders rather than making requests. "Judge Morrison, the people of this community deserve to see justice carried out promptly. Every delay sends a message that criminals can escape punishment through legal technicalities." The cattle baron's intervention revealed the extent of his influence over local legal proceedings, but it also exposed him to charges of improper interference with judicial decisions. Mrs. Patterson seized the opportunity to speak her piece. "Charles Brennan, the people of this community deserve to see real justice, not the execution of innocent men to cover up crimes committed by your employees." Her words carried the moral authority of an elderly woman who had devoted her life to education and truth-telling. The crowd's reaction suggested that many townspeople respected her enough to take her accusations seriously. Emma moved closer to the courthouse entrance, determination overriding her physical weakness. "Judge Morrison, my brother is locked in a cell waiting to die for something he didn't do. Every minute of delay increases his suffering, but every minute also brings us closer to proving his innocence." The young woman's plea touched something in the crowd's collective conscience. Jake could see expressions of sympathy and doubt appearing on faces that had previously shown only acceptance of the official narrative. Frank Morrison pushed his way closer to the confrontation, his hand resting on his gun in a gesture that was clearly intended to intimidate. "This is all lies and desperate accusations from people who can't accept that Thomas Mitchell is guilty as charged." His aggressive posture prompted several soldiers to position themselves where they could respond quickly if violence erupted. The presence of armed military personnel made it clear that any attempt at intimidation would be met with overwhelming force. Jake sensed that public opinion was beginning to shift as townspeople recognized the serious nature of the evidence being presented. The military documents and Mrs. Patterson's journal provided credibility that desperate last-minute pleas alone could never have achieved. "Judge Morrison," Jake said formally, "I request that you examine this evidence immediately and postpone the execution until it can be properly evaluated. An innocent man's life hangs in the balance." The judge looked around the crowd once more, then at Sergeant Martinez and the military patrol, clearly recognizing that his decision would be witnessed and potentially reviewed by federal authorities. "Sheriff Kane, postpone the execution for 2 hours while I examine the evidence presented. If it proves substantial, we'll schedule a new hearing to determine whether the original verdict should be reconsidered." Kane's face showed his reluctance to comply, but the judge's order left him no choice. "Yes, Your Honor. I'll inform the executioner that the proceedings are delayed." Charles Brennan's expression darkened with anger at this unexpected setback to his plans. "Judge Morrison, I protest this delay in the strongest possible terms." "Justice delayed is justice denied." Emma swayed on her feet, the emotional strain of the confrontation combining with her heart condition to push her beyond her physical limits. Doc Hayes moved quickly to support her, checking her pulse with obvious concern. "Emma needs medical attention immediately," Hayes announced. "The stress of this situation is putting dangerous strain on her heart." Jake realized that Emma's collapse might actually work in their favor by generating additional sympathy for Thomas Mitchell's situation. A young woman literally dying from worry about her innocent brother's fate would be a powerful image in the minds of potential supporters. Mrs. Patterson moved to Emma's other side, offering what comfort she could to the suffering young woman. "Child, you've done your brother proud by fighting for him like this. Now let the doctor take care of you while the rest of us see this through to the end." Judge Morrison disappeared into the courthouse, carrying the military documents and Mrs. Patterson's journal. His examination of the evidence would determine whether Thomas Mitchell lived or died, and whether the truth about organized cattle theft in Millfield would finally be exposed. Sergeant Martinez detailed 2 of his men to accompany the judge and ensure that the evidence received fair consideration. The military's direct involvement in the judicial process created an unprecedented situation that left local officials uncertain about their authority. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake noticed that Frank Morrison and his associates remained nearby, their hostile stares making clear that they viewed the delay as temporary rather than final. They would undoubtedly use the time to plan countermeasures designed to discredit the evidence or eliminate witnesses. Charles Brennan approached Jake directly, his voice low but carrying unmistakable menace. "Coleman, you've interfered in matters that don't concern you. I suggest you leave Millfield immediately if you value your health." Jake met the cattle baron's gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by threats. "Mr. Brennan, I'm not leaving until Thomas Mitchell is free and the real criminals are behind bars." The direct challenge drew a cold smile from Brennan. "We'll see about that, stranger. We'll see about that." As Brennan walked away, Jake realized that the confrontation was far from over. Delaying the execution was only the first step toward exposing the truth, and powerful forces would continue working to protect their interests, regardless of justice or innocence. Doc Hayes helped Emma toward his medical office, where she could rest while receiving proper care for her heart condition. "Jake," She's shown incredible courage, but her body can't take much more of this stress. We need to resolve this situation. Quickly, Mrs. Patterson gathered her journal and prepared to follow the group to safety. Young man, I've lived in this town for 82 years, and I've never seen anyone stand up to Charles Brennan like you did today. Whatever happens next, you've already accomplished something remarkable. Jake felt the weight of expectations settling on his shoulders as townspeople looked to him for leadership in challenging the corrupt system that had controlled their lives for so long. Thomas Mitchell's fate had become symbolic of whether justice could triumph over power and wealth. As they walked toward Doc Hayes's office, Jake caught sight of the jail where Thomas sat waiting to learn whether he would live or die. The young man had no way of knowing about the dramatic confrontation taking place on his behalf, but Jake was determined that Thomas Mitchell would walk free before the day ended. The battle for truth and justice in Millfield had begun, and Jake Coleman was prepared to see it through to whatever end awaited. 2 hours stretched like eternity as the town of Millfield waited for Judge Morrison's decision. Inside Doc Hayes's office, Emma rested on a narrow bed while the physician monitored her weakening pulse. The strain of the morning's confrontation had pushed her damaged heart beyond safe limits, but her eyes remained alert and focused on the window that faced the courthouse. Jake paced the small office, his mind working through contingency plans for every possible outcome. If Judge Morrison ruled against them despite the evidence, they would need to act quickly to protect witnesses and prevent retaliation. If the judge ruled in their favor, Charles Brennan would likely escalate his efforts to suppress the truth through violence. Mrs. Patterson sat in a wooden chair near Emma's bedside, her journal open as she continued documenting the historic events unfolding around them. 67 years I've been writing in this book, she said quietly. Never thought I'd live to see the day when someone finally stood up to Charles Brennan. Through the window, they could see Sergeant Martinez and his men maintaining their positions around the courthouse, while townspeople gathered in small groups to discuss the morning's revelations. The military presence had clearly emboldened some citizens who had previously been afraid to voice their doubts about the official narrative. A knock at the door interrupted the tense waiting. Doc Hayes opened it to reveal a young boy Jake recognized as the courthouse clerk's son. "Doc Hayes," the boy said breathlessly, "Judge Morrison wants to see you and Mr. Coleman right away. He says to bring the lady with the journal, too." Emma struggled to sit up despite her weakness. "I'm coming with you." "Emma, you're in no condition to walk to the courthouse," Hayes protested. "Your heart needs rest." "My heart needs to see my brother freed," Emma replied with quiet determination. "Help me up, doctor. I won't miss the moment when Thomas learns. He's going to live." Jake moved to support Emma's other arm as she stood on trembling legs. Her face was pale as parchment, but her green eyes blazed with the same fierce spirit that had sustained her throughout the ordeal. The walk to the courthouse attracted attention from every person on the street. Word had spread throughout Millfield about the confrontation between Jake's group and the local authorities, and citizens who had remained neutral were now choosing sides based on what they had witnessed. Inside the courthouse, Judge Morrison sat behind his imposing desk with the military documents and Mrs. Patterson's journal arranged before him. His expression was carefully neutral, but Jake noticed tension lines around his eyes that suggested the decision had not been easy. Sergeant Martinez stood at attention near the window, his presence serving as a reminder that federal authority was observing the proceedings. 2 additional soldiers flanked the judge's chambers, making it clear that military oversight was comprehensive. "I have reviewed the evidence presented," Judge Morrison began formally. "The military patrol reports document cattle movement activities that correspond to the time frame and location described in Thomas Mitchell's testimony. Mrs. Patterson's journal provides corroborating observations that support claims of organized theft involving individuals employed by Charles Brennan. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the careful legal language that typically preceded significant judicial decisions. The judge was laying groundwork for a ruling that would either vindicate or condemn their efforts. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, the medical testimony provided by Dr. Hayes regarding the nature of Thomas Mitchell's injuries is inconsistent with the prosecution's theory that he was attempting to steal cattle when his horse went down. Emma gripped Jake's arm tighter, her breathing becoming more labored as emotion and physical strain combined to stress her weakened heart. Doc Hayes moved closer, ready to provide medical assistance if she collapsed. Charles Brennan entered the chamber without knocking, his face dark with anger and his expensive boots striking the wooden floor with authority. Judge Morrison, I demand to know why these proceedings are being conducted without proper legal representation for the injured parties. The cattle baron's interruption violated courtroom protocol, but his relationship to the judge and his economic influence in the community had always granted him special privileges. Mr. Brennan, Judge Morrison replied carefully, these are preliminary proceedings to evaluate new evidence. If formal charges are filed based on this evidence, all parties will be entitled to proper representation. Frank Morrison followed his employer into the chamber, his gun belt conspicuously adjusted for quick access. The foreman's presence created additional tension in the already charged atmosphere. Your Honor, Frank Morrison said with barely controlled aggression, these accusations are nothing but desperate lies from people trying to save a guilty man. Thomas Mitchell was caught red-handed stealing Mr. Brennan's cattle. Mrs. Patterson rose from her chair with surprising steadiness, her journal clutched in weathered hands. Frank Morrison, I watched you and your associates moving cattle through this town on 17 separate occasions over the past 6 months. Every incident is documented in this journal with dates, times, and descriptions. The elderly woman's direct challenge drew gasps from observers who had never seen anyone confront Frank Morrison so boldly. Her moral authority as a retired teacher and longtime community member gave weight to her accusations that mere rumors could never have carried. Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. Based on the evidence presented, I am ordering the immediate release of Thomas Mitchell pending a full investigation into the charges against him. Furthermore, I am issuing warrants for the arrest of Frank Morrison, Carl Webb, and Rodriguez on suspicion of cattle theft and conspiracy. The ruling struck the courtroom like lightning. Emma swayed against Jake's supporting arm, overcome with relief and exhaustion. Mrs. Patterson smiled with quiet satisfaction at seeing justice finally served after years of documenting corruption. Charles Brennan's face turned purple with rage. This is outrageous. You're releasing a convicted criminal based on the fantasies of a sick girl and a senile old woman. Judge Morrison's expression hardened. Mr. Brennan, the evidence presented includes official military documentation that cannot be dismissed as fantasy. Your continued interference with these proceedings is approaching contempt of court. Frank Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, a gesture that immediately caught the attention of the soldiers present. Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, his own weapon ready but not drawn. Mr. Morrison, I advise you to keep your hands visible and avoid any actions that might be interpreted as threatening, the sergeant said calmly. The standoff lasted several tense seconds before Frank Morrison slowly raised his hands. The presence of trained military personnel made violent resistance futile, but his expression promised that the conflict was far from over. Sheriff Kane entered the chamber, looking confused and uncertain about his role in the unfolding drama. Judge Morrison, what are my instructions regarding the prisoners? Release Thomas Mitchell immediately, the judge ordered. Arrest Frank Morrison, Carl Webb, and Rodriguez on the charges I specified. And Sheriff, ensure that all prisoners receive proper protection while in custody. The implication was clear. Kane's previous handling of Thomas Mitchell had demonstrated either incompetence or corruption, and the judge was warning him that continued misconduct would be observed by federal authorities. Charles Brennan stepped closer to Judge Morrison's desk, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Morrison, you're making a serious mistake. This community depends on my goodwill for its prosperity. Don't forget who holds the mortgages on half. The businesses in this town." The naked threat revealed the extent of Brennan's control over local affairs, but it also exposed him to charges of intimidating judicial officers. Sergeant Martinez moved closer, clearly prepared to intervene if the situation escalated further. Emma suddenly collapsed against Jake, her breathing becoming shallow and irregular. Doc Hayes immediately knelt beside her, checking her pulse and examining her pale complexion. "Her heart is failing," Hayes announced urgently. "The stress has triggered a crisis. I need to get her to my office immediately." The medical emergency created a moment of human drama that transcended the legal and political conflicts dividing the room. Even Charles Brennan stepped back as Doc Hayes and Jake carefully lifted Emma between them. "Thomas," Emma whispered weakly. "I need to see Thomas before." She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone present understood what she meant. Emma Mitchell had sacrificed her health to save her brother, and she wanted to see him free before her damaged heart gave out completely. Sheriff Kane hurried from the chamber to release Thomas from his cell, while Doc Hayes and Jake carried Emma toward the jail where she could be reunited with her brother. The irony was not lost on anyone present that the woman who had fought hardest to prove Thomas's innocence was now dying from the effort. The jail cell block was dim and smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. Thomas Mitchell sat on the narrow cot, his face drawn from weeks of poor food and endless worry. When the cell door creaked open and he saw Emma being helped inside by Doc Hayes and Jake, his weary resignation turned instantly to alarm. "Emma, what happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Thomas," she lied, forcing a faint smile as they settled her into a chair brought from the sheriff's office. "You're free. The judge has ordered your release." Thomas stared around the cell in disbelief, struggling to grasp the words. "Free? After the trial, the conviction, how can that be?" "New evidence cleared you," Jake explained. "Military reports proved you were telling the truth about the cattle theft. Mrs. Patterson's journal backed it up with months of notes on suspicious activity. And Doc Hayes testified about your injuries. It all came together and exposed the real guilty men." Thomas dropped to one knee beside Emma, holding her frail hands. "Emma, you look so pale. Have you been eating, resting at all?" She gave a soft laugh that carried both joy and weariness. "I've been too busy saving your life. But it's done. You're safe now." Their reunion was cut short by the clank of shackles. Frank Morrison was marched in between Sheriff Kane and two soldiers, fury and fear warring on his face as his lies unraveled. "This isn't finished," he snarled, glaring at Thomas. "Brennan has powerful friends. You don't know what you've stirred up." Thomas stood tall, facing him. "You framed me for your crimes. You were ready to see me hang just to save yourself." Morrison's expression curdled into hate. "If you'd kept to your own business that night, none of this would have happened." The bitter admission hung heavy in the air, clearer proof than any courtroom testimony. Even Sheriff Kane looked shaken at how easily Morrison confessed to the frame-up. As Morrison was dragged toward a cell, Charles Brennan strode in, his calm faculty cracking into rage. "Thomas Mitchell, you've made yourself a powerful enemy. The law may spare you, but there are other kinds of justice." Jake stepped forward, hand resting on his gun belt. "That sounded like a threat, Brennan, and against a man now under federal protection." Sergeant Martinez appeared at Jake's side, his tone sharp. "Any attempt to intimidate witnesses or victims will go straight to the territorial authorities. Choose your words carefully." For once, Brennan found himself powerless. Military oversight stripped him of the fear and bribery he usually commanded. His glare swept the jail before he muttered, "We'll see. This territory has its own way of handling troublemakers." Then he turned on his heel and left. Thomas helped Emma rise for the slow walk to Doc Hayes's office. She leaned on him, her face still pale, her breath shallow. "Thomas," she whispered, "promise me this. Promise you'll use this second chance for good. Don't let anger or bitterness ruin your future." Tears glimmered in his eyes. "I promise, Emma, and I'll take better care of you from now on. No more reckless risks, no more danger." They stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, where a crowd waited to see Thomas Mitchell walk free. That morning he had faced the gallows now. Before the townsfolk, he stood a vindicated man. Near the courthouse steps, Mrs. Patterson clutched her journal, recording the final chapter. She smiled with the pride of a teacher whose lesson had been learned. "Thomas Mitchell," she called, "you've been given a precious gift today. Don't waste it." Thomas clasped her hands gratefully. "Mrs. Patterson, I can never repay you. You risked everything to prove my innocence." She patted his hand gently. "Child, I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because it was right, and because someone needed to stand up to the bullies who think power gives them the right to hurt innocent people." Doc Hayes interrupted to insist that Emma be taken to his office for rest and medication. As they walked across the town square, Jake noticed that the gallows still stood like a reminder of how close they had come to irreversible tragedy. "What happens now?" Thomas asked as they reached the doctor's office. Jake considered the question carefully. Frank Morrison and his associates were in jail, but Charles Brennan remained free and dangerous. The corrupt system that had nearly killed Thomas was damaged but not destroyed. "Now you rebuild your lives," Jake replied. "Emma gets the medical care she needs, you find honest work, and both of you stay alert for future threats." Emma settled into Doc Hayes's examination room, her color slightly improved but her condition still precarious. "Mr. Coleman, what about you? Will you stay in Millfield?" Jake looked out the window at the town that had been transformed by the day's events. Corrupt officials had been exposed, innocent people had been vindicated, and truth had triumphed over power and wealth. It was the kind of victory he had dreamed of achieving for his own family years earlier. "I'll stay until I'm sure you're both safe," Jake promised. "Charles Brennan won't give up easily, and there may be other people involved in the conspiracy who haven't been identified yet." Through the window, Jake could see Sergeant Martinez organizing his men for the return journey to Fort Silverton. The military intervention had been crucial to exposing the truth, but ongoing protection would depend on civilian authorities maintaining the integrity of the legal system. As evening approached, word arrived that Carl Webb and Rodriguez had been arrested attempting to cross the Mexican border with a wagon full of stolen goods. Their capture provided additional evidence of the theft operation and eliminated 2 potential threats to witnesses. Emma's condition stabilized as Doc Hayes administered medication and monitored her heart rhythm. Color returned to her cheeks, and her breathing became less labored, though she remained weak from the ordeal. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something. When I thought you were going to die, I was prepared to give my life for yours. I told Doc Hayes I would offer my heart if it could save you." Thomas knelt beside her bed, tears streaming down his face. "Emma, you already gave your heart to save me. Your courage, your determination, your refusal to give up when everyone else had written me off. That's the heart that saved my life." Jake felt his own throat tighten with emotion at witnessing the depth of love between the siblings. Their bond reminded him of his relationship with his own sister and the tragic price of his failure to protect her. When she needed him most, Mrs. Patterson entered the office carrying a tray of food from the boarding house. "I thought you young people might be hungry after all the excitement. Thomas, you look like you could use a proper meal." As they shared the simple supper, Jake realized that his long journey from guilt-ridden drifter to defender of justice was finally complete. He had found redemption not through grand gestures or dramatic acts of heroism, but through the simple decision to stand up for truth when it mattered most. The next morning brought news that Charles Brennan had departed Millfield. During the night, taking his remaining loyal employees and heading toward California. His hasty departure suggested that he feared federal investigation might expose additional criminal activities. Thomas returned to his job at the blacksmith shop, where his employer welcomed him back with relief and apologies for doubting his innocence. Emma resumed teaching at the schoolhouse, though Doc Hayes limited her hours to protect her still fragile health. Jake prepared to leave Millfield, confident that Thomas and Emma were safe and that the town's corrupt system had been permanently damaged. His work was finished, and new challenges awaited him on the frontier. As he saddled his horse for departure, Emma appeared at the livery stable, walking slowly but steadily without assistance. "Mr. Coleman, I wanted to thank you one more time. Before you left, you gave us back our lives when we thought everything was lost." Jake adjusted his saddle with careful attention to detail, using the routine task to control his emotions. "Emma, you and Thomas gave me something just as valuable. You showed me that it's never too late to do the right thing." Emma smiled, the expression transforming her face with genuine happiness for the first time since Jake had met her. "Where will you go now?" Jake mounted his horse and looked down at the young woman who had inspired him to find his courage again. "Wherever. People need help fighting injustice. There are probably other towns like Millfield, other families like yours, other men like Thomas waiting for someone to stand up for them." As Jake rode out of Millfield, he carried with him the knowledge that his sister's death had not been meaningless if it had led him to save Thomas Mitchell's life. Sometimes redemption came not from changing the past, but from ensuring that past failures didn't prevent future victories. The morning sun painted the desert landscape in gold and crimson as Jake Coleman rode toward whatever challenges awaited him on the frontier. Behind him, Thomas and Emma Mitchell began rebuilding their lives with the precious gift of freedom that had almost been lost forever. Justice had triumphed in Millfield, but the struggle between right and wrong would continue in countless other places where good people faced corruption and cruelty. Jake was ready for that fight now, armed with the knowledge that standing up for truth always mattered, even when the odds seemed impossible. The gallows in Millfield's town square was torn down that afternoon, its wood used to build a new schoolhouse, where Emma Mitchell would teach children about courage, justice, and the importance of never giving up hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.